Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and this episode is TTS Thursday number 3. Today's topic is on triathlon bike training as a logical follow-up to last week's episode on swim training. We'll get right into it after thanking our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration. Precision Hydration help you match your sweat sodium concentration level to an appropriately concentrated electrolyte supplement so that you can adequately replace the right amount of sodium that you lose. And this becomes especially important when you're doing longer workouts or events and when the temperatures are high and humidity is high. People might lose anywhere from around about 200 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat to 2000 milligrams, so that's a tenfold difference. And Precision Hydration have therefore created supplements of different strengths, and you can find out a ballpark estimate of where you are and therefore which supplement you should select by taking Precision Hydration's free sweat test, get a free hydration plan, and then select your supplements accordingly. You can get 15% off your electrolytes with the promo code THATTriathlonshow15 on precisionhydration.com. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka are the world-leading manufacturers of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses. Roka are trusted by athletes such as Javier Gomez, Lucy Charles Barclay, Katie Zafiris, Mario Mola, and many, many others. And in the Ironman World Championships in Kona, when there have been official swimskin counts as well as unofficial swimskin counts, Roka have typically been on top with the most representation among the pro athletes in the field. You can get 20% off your entire Roka order with the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS. And one more thing before we get into the topic, I would just like to ask you that if you are enjoying the podcast, please rate and review on whatever platform you're listening to. It is really important to help spread the podcast to help new listeners find it and keep the podcast sustainable for the long term. Now on to today's topic, bike training for triathlon. Just like we did for swim training, we'll start by looking at the demands of triathlon cycling. And for the purpose of this episode, since most of our listeners do non-draft triathlon, that's what we'll focus on today, not so much the draft legal side. We might do that another time in a separate episode. But to be fair, the differences aren't super big. I mean, there are much more similarities than there are differences for sure. Now, in non-draft triathlon, whether we're talking a sprint distance race or an Ironman, the bike leg is mostly about sustained power. Of course, as we have talked about quite recently on the podcast with scientific triathlon coach James Teagle, things like the course profile and even things like weather conditions with wind, they are really important to account for. So sustained power doesn't necessarily mean steady power, even on a perfectly flat course like a speedway, as we saw in Challenge Miami recently, because those very, very strong winds really forced the athletes to some big variations in power. But regardless of variations, almost all triathlon courses require you to hold a sustained power for a fairly long time. And this can be anything from a bit under 30 minutes for fast athletes in a sprint distance race to 6-7 hours for less experienced athletes doing their first Ironman, for example. So the point here is that when looking at your power profile as a cyclist, triathlon very clearly favors athletes that can hold threshold for a long time, and those can hold a relatively high percentage of threshold for long durations. So sustained power, and even if there are variations within that, let's say you're doing a half Ironman and you're averaging 85% of threshold, but some of the time you're at 75%, some of the time you're at 90 or 95%. That's all well and good, but it's still about sustained power, averaging that high power for 2.5 hours, 3 hours, whatever it may be. We could, of course, on the physiology side, talk about things like Vo2 Max and Threshold, which, of course, are incredibly important for triathletes, because you want to have a sustained power that is high, not just in relative terms, so relative to Threshold or Vo2 Max, but also in absolute terms. So you would rather be able to ride at 300 watts for whatever the race distance is than at 200 watts, for example. So Vo2 Max and Threshold are super important, obviously. They are kind of baked into the whole catch-all term of sustained power, because if you have a high VO2 max and a high threshold, then you will also have a higher sustained power than somebody with a much lower threshold and VO2 max. But then for you can still within that threshold and VO2 max work on like really maximizing what you can eke out of those physiological parameters and really hold a high percentage for a long time. So basically, when we talk about sustained power, VO2 max and threshold are baked in there. Sustained power is not a physiological parameter. It's just a term that we can use to describe what triathlon is about or what triathlon cycling is about. But other than the physical aspects and physiological aspects, we also, of course, in non-draft racing have aerodynamics as a super important aspect. Two athletes with the same power and same weight can have dramatically different bike splits if their aerodynamics are very different. For example, or an Ironman, I checked my own data for an upcoming race on best bike split, and just this will depend on your power output, of course, and the speed that power output results in. But I checked what a 10% increase in CDA would lead to for me, and it led to an increase in Ironman time by almost 10 minutes. And considering that CDA can vary by a lot more than just 10% from rider to rider, that's a very easily happen thing, that you might have the exact same power and power to weight, but if power to aerodynamics is lower, then you'll go a lot slower. And here it's important to point out that as much as gear and equipment are important for aerodynamics, the rider and their position on the bike and holding that position for the duration of the bike leg, those are the most impactful factors by far behind your aerodynamic drag. So this is crucial to practice, not least because it's one thing to be aerodynamic when you start the race, but quite another thing to be able to still be that when you finish the bike leg. But let's start with the physical training aspect and the fitness aspect of bike training. This is obviously an incredibly broad discussion. Many books have been written about this, but I'll try to keep this discussion nice and tight and talk about just a few key things and key pieces of advice that will help achieve the objectives of improving your ability to hold power for extended durations, as we discussed above, is what triathlon is about, with certain power variations, of course. There are obviously differences in how you should train depending on what your goal distance is, and more so depending on what your ability is, whether you're a beginner or a very experienced athlete. The training for a beginner for their first sprint distance, for example, doesn't need to be as structured and specific as that of somebody training for going to Kona. A beginner can focus more on just riding consistently, trying to get in 2 rides per week, every single week. That would be a great starting point. Riding outdoors regularly to get comfortable with bike handling on different roads and on different terrain. Making sure that they learn how to do things like changing a flat tire, if that happens, and things like that. And if you're a beginner but training for a longer race like an Olympic or a 7.3, then also working up to that goal distance in training is an important part of the training process, simply building the endurance to go the distance. This does not mean that the beginner doesn't benefit from structured and specific training. They absolutely do, and they will improve faster and be able to go faster on race day. I would say that if you want a basic structure, we'll talk about this a bit later on, but for beginners, doing one longer endurance ride per week, and that can be an outdoor ride, preferably. Longer here is relative to goal distance, of course. For training for a sprint, it would be very different compared to training for your first half-distance race. But if you do that longer endurance ride, and then you do another ride that is a more structured workout of some sort, that would be a really good starting point for many beginners. But at the same time, I would say, this is what I want to stress here, that for some people new to the sport, maybe new to training overall, just simply building that habit of consistency is enough of a challenge as is. And having something very structured to do can seem a bit daunting and feel a bit like a chore or like a job. So if you're somebody that at this point in time just prefer to just go out and ride, and that's what makes you be consistent, then that's better than having a structured plan that you're not able to follow and not able to do consistently. Another thing that I want to say on the beginner side of things, and well, for anybody, you don't have to have a power meter to train effectively. Heart rate is a great tool, and while it's not quite as precise as power, it does tell you some things that power does not tell. It tells you a lot about the internal strain that your body goes through, and it can absolutely help you train in a very structured and effective manner. And of course, rating of perceived exertion, RPE, is something that you should always use in any workout, and learn to listen, feel how hard the effort is. And you can learn to do workouts very effectively with RPE alone. But that being said, it does help to have either heart rate or power to calibrate your RPE and learn what, get sort of a calibration curve for that. So of course you can get by with just RPE from the start, but I would say that if you don't have a power meter, get a heart rate monitor. They're cheap, so that would be a great bonus for beginners. The more advanced you become, the more important it also becomes to be structured and very deliberate with your training. But on the flip side, it also becomes quite easy to maybe forget about the basics while chasing marginal gains, and perhaps not always seeing the forest for the trees. And that's one of the biggest challenges, especially in this information age for the advanced athletes, that never forget the hierarchy of needs and the basic principles in the chase for marginal gains, and adding 1 or 2 watts to your threshold or to your race power. So those are a couple of things to think about depending on your ability level. Let's get down to a numbered list of key pieces of advice for the physical aspects of bike training for triathlon, just like we did last week for swimming. And the first piece of advice here is that in your training, make sure you spend at least some time on all different parts of the intensity spectrum, from low intensity to very, very high intensity. Of course, the various lower intensities will happen naturally if you do endurance rides, which you should be doing. But what I'm saying here is that you shouldn't necessarily think that any one high intensity is the be-all end-all, or any one high or moderately high intensity is something you should avoid. I think that over the course of a season, it makes sense to have spent some time on all of these different parts on the intensity spectrum, from very, very short and sharp things to something that you can do for more like a handful of minutes, and then all the way down to something that's more like a Ironman or half Ironman race pace, which you can hold for a long time, obviously, but that can still be moderately hard, not exactly easy. So depending on what level of athlete you are, for somebody who takes a longer time to go around, then actually you will have to do those long races at an easy intensity. So yeah, different parts of the seasons will have a different focus. You don't have to be doing all things at all times. And you can also just add in small pieces of maintenance every now and then. This is something that I like to do with my athletes. For example, when we approach the specific preparation for races, and we will have a month or two where we focus mostly on things around race pace, or at least more like moderately hard intensities, and not so much high intensity that we might have been doing at other parts of the season. But maintaining some of that is something that I like to do. So every couple of weeks at least, including some high intensity, including some 1 or 2 or 3 minute efforts, maybe even just as a build set before a main set of race pace. So it doesn't have to be complicated to fit it all in. But also you don't have to fit it all in at all times. You shouldn't fit it all in at all times. You should just focus on the priorities. But over the course of a season, it makes sense to basically, the point here is to not avoid any intensity, and also not think that any one intensity is so massively better than another that it makes sense to only focus, to put all your eggs in that one basket. Also, one final point here, there's nothing wrong with doing a kitchen sink workout every once in a while. Kitchen sink workouts, for those not familiar, means basically a workout where you have a mixture of intensities mixed in. So you might start by doing some sprints after your warm-up, and then do some Vo2 Max efforts, let's say 2-minute intervals, and then you might be doing some threshold efforts, and then some sweet spot efforts, and something like that. Those can be very fun and also challenging workouts. And as maintenance of all the systems you built up, or all the intensities that you've touched on earlier in the season, those workouts can actually be quite effective to stay in touch with all those different intensities on the power duration curve, so to say. All right. So advice number 2 is that in cycling, perhaps more than any of the other 3 disciplines, volume is king. To me, it's not even a perhaps. To me, it just is. But I guess I can't say there's no scientific evidence for this. It's just anecdotal knowledge. But basically, cycling, it takes quite some time to build up fitness there, but it can be greatly accelerated by cycling more. And cycling is the one where people respond the easiest to just doing more cycling. So if you can do more cycling, then you will likely improve. That's all there is to this point. Volume is very important. And it's not, the reason that I'm putting this as a key piece of advice is that in swimming, of course, volume is important, but also it really depends on the quality with which you are swimming. And you can have bottlenecks that prevent any sort of volume from being effective. If you, for example, swim with really poor technique and you're not focusing on improving that technique. And in running, volume is not necessarily king, because you might get injured. So in running, you basically want to find the minimal effective dose more so than think that more volume is going to make you faster at all times, because that's not the case. But cycling, it's very, very safe to increase volume. So advice number 3 is that endurance riding at a steady or low intensity, is always going to be zone 2 in a 5-zone model, or even zone 1 in a 5-zone model. That is always going to be the base upon which you layer intensity. And endurance workouts allow you to recover well in between your hard workouts, while also accumulating that volume, which is important for your long-term improvements. But they do allow you to recover between your hard workouts, so you can go really hard and get the most out of those harder and more challenging workouts. So just like you make sure that you eat your vegetables every day, make sure that you do your endurance workouts every week. How to do your endurance workouts, this could be an entirely different episode, an entire different topic. It depends on things like your ability level, your goal event, the amount of training you're doing, the amount of fatigue you're carrying. But I would say the 2 main drivers here are making sure that you don't go so hard that you sacrifice the quality of your harder workouts, making sure that you always give yourself give yourself a low enough intensity that you can recover and perform well in those key workouts. And so that would be one thing. And the second thing would be, just generally speaking, so this relates to the same point, but generally speaking, if you do less volume overall, and then your endurance workouts can be at a slightly higher intensity. Maybe somebody who's doing in total for the triathlon training, they're doing 7 or 8 hours, they can do their endurance rides at 70-75% of FTP, but somebody that's training for 15 hours would be doing them at 65% or so. So that's on average, and there might be variations there. Some might be 55, some might be 75. But that's a general pattern that we're seeing. Tip number 4 is that when it comes to the harder, more challenging rides, specificity is always going to be very, very important. And in particular, when you are in that period of race prep in the last 4 to 8 weeks before your race. Specificity, however, doesn't have to mean sitting and hammering away at whatever your goal average race power is. Let's say it's 250 watts for, it doesn't matter what event it is. You don't need to just sit and hammer 250 watt intervals, but specificity means anything remotely close to that average race pace, because you will probably be experiencing all of these intensities in the race due to the terrain, due to overtaking, due to winds, and so on. So something that is, so if your goal race pace is 250 watts and your threshold is 300 watts, and then intervals at 275 watts are quite race specific. Not to do them at a lower amount than your total race time, of course, but still it's close enough to the race pace to be quite specific. So what I'm saying is that in that race prep period, you want to be doing workouts kind of at and around that target race intensity. Also, I really like to prescribe mixed workouts where, for example, a favorite of mine would be to do for somebody targeting 85% of FTP as their 7.3 race pace, a number of 20-minute intervals where the average is 85%, but we do that as 5 minutes at 85%, 5 minutes at 90%, 5 minutes at 80%, and 5 minutes at 85%, for example. So there are variations there in that power. So yeah, that was number 4. Specificity is important. Number 5, pacing. Very important when it comes to triathlon bike training, because obviously we all realize that pacing is important in racing, but we need to think about this in training as well, because you learn how to pace in races, but you also learn how to pace in training. And here's a big pet peeve of mine. If you just get your structured workouts from your coach or from your training plan, and you keep your Erg Mode on at all times, and you end up being, whether that structured workout is created as this is a bit of basically technical, doesn't really matter here, but Erg Mode, for those not familiar with smart trainers, the smart trainer basically sets the resistance so that it's automatically at a given power, and you just have to pedal. And if you pedal slower, then the resistance increases, and if you pedal faster, then the resistance decreases, so that you always hit that target power. But usually, for example, if you have a training plan or a coach where it says that you should be doing your intervals at whatever it is, 80 to 90% of FTP, then your Erg Mode will place you usually, at least in Swift, this is how it works, at 85% of FTP. And if you don't think at all about how you're feeling and you just pedal on at that 85%, then you might not realize that, on this day I'm actually feeling really good, and I might get more out of this workout by doing it at 90%, because that was part of that target prescribed range. And on the other hand, on this day, I'm not feeling quite recovered. My sleep maybe wasn't the best, and I had a stressful day at work. Maybe I should just keep it at 80% today, because it feels quite a bit harder than it did last week. So you need to keep your brain in the game and train with presence, just as we talked about last week for swimming. And even in some cases, and I'm a bit afraid of saying this. Well, I'm only afraid of saying half of this. In some workouts, you may need to adjust intensity down below what your target intensity is. And it might be just going and doing an endurance ride or skipping the ride altogether. But well, that's not about pacing really. So in terms of pacing, if we stick to that topic, let's say you have a 30-minute tempo segment at the end of an endurance run, which is a favorite workout of mine that I'll talk about a bit later, and your target power is 80 to 85% for the tempo segment, and you're sitting there and trying to ride at 80%, but you realize that on this day maybe the ride felt quite hard on you, or it was longer than normal, or you didn't fuel great during the ride, and you just realize that I probably won't be able to last 30 minutes at this intensity. But instead of calling it a day, you might just adjust down a little bit to 78% or 77% of threshold, and that might help you get through. Those are the kind of adjustments that you can do when you're present in your training, and that will help you learn pacing, and that will be hugely beneficial on race day as well. So yeah, constantly assessing how you're feeling and taking action on it will allow you to do it on race day easily and much more effectively than otherwise. And the thing that I was afraid of saying is that in some cases, you may actually increase intensity above what was planned. And I'm saying this with great hesitancy, but I do think that for athletes that are very responsible and know their bodies very, very well, I would say this is for experienced athletes only, and and also athletes that aren't prone to overdoing things necessarily. For them, I think that there are some cases where you might have that 80 to 85% target for your tempo workout, but you feel so good on the day that you feel that, okay, this is the day when I push it a little bit, not completely, but I push it a little bit, and you go to 90% instead. So that might be okay on the day. Again, this depends on the athlete, and I'm not saying that this is something that everybody should be doing. I'm saying it with great hesitancy, but that's a great thing that will teach you how to pace if you know that, okay, I'm actually feeling so good at the beginning of this segment that I know I will be able to do quite a bit more. And one final thing that will teach you how to pace better is doing time trials, and ideally, of course, time trial races outdoors, but maybe even doing time trials in training. That can be really beneficial for developing pacing, whether it's outdoors or indoors on the trainer. Advice number 6, and that was number 5, pacing. Number 6 is think about your cyclist profile or your power profile. Cyclist profile is what I want to say here. So if we look at road cycling, we talk about a cyclist in terms of different categories of cyclists, like GC riders, that is the general classification riders, that are the ones that fight for the Tour de France and Giro d'Italia because they can climb very well, so they don't lose time on climbs, but they can also time trial very well, so they don't lose any time there either. Then we have the pure climbers that are not necessarily GC contenders because they can't time trial. And we have the time trialists that aren't GC contenders because they maybe can't climb as well. Then we have the sprinters, of course, that contend for the flatter stages of the tours. We have the punchers that are good on rolling courses with shorter climbs and basically attacks and things like that. So on. So if you categorize yourself in one of these categories, then what would that be? And you can think about how you do relative to your peers on hard group rides. Are you somebody that climb away from them, but you suffer on the flats? Or can you repeatedly attack them hard for a few minutes and gap them? And that might be more of a puncher category. Or can you out-sprint the bunch when you're coming back in? A sprinter, obviously. Or can you out-time trial them? So that one is pretty self-explanatory, I think. And as a triathlete, you definitely want to be on that time trialist or general classification rider side of the spectrum, because most of our courses are time trial courses, but also we sometimes have some climbing, sometimes a fair amount of climbing on the courses. So sustained power is something that for both time trialist and general classification riders is key, just as it is for us triathletes. So that's where you want to fall. And if you are not particularly strong as those types of cyclists, then that means that you might have to focus a bit more on turning something that is a weakness into a strength and try to become more GC or more time trialist than puncher or sprinter. So one way of thinking about your profile is how you perform on local group rides. You can also do things like metabolic tests. You can do field tests and use either just your looking at the power data and comparing over time, but you can also use software like WKO. That software will tell you what they think you are, like if you're a time trialist or a sprinter or all-rounder, whatever, based on your power duration curve. And if you are somebody that, if you don't have access to, if you don't do group rides and you don't have access to metabolic tests, one thing that you can do as a field test, which this might get a little bit nerdy and too detailed for some, but I think some will like it, so I'm going to give it here. It's a key performance indicator that I use with some athletes that I have do field tests. It's simply to do a 3-minute all-out time trial, and then on a separate day, when fully recovered, a 12-minute all-out time trial. The ratio between these two average powers, the average power for 12 minutes divided by the average power for 3 minutes, that is something that I find interesting to look at. And as a minimum goal for this ratio, I want to get the athlete to 81 to 82%, so that you can hold your... So for example, if your 3-minute power is 200 watts, this makes the math easy, then your 12-minute power should be at least 162 162 watts. For some riders, it can be very difficult to get any higher than this 81 to 82% ratio, simply due to the nature of their physiology, so that's fine. But a stretch goal would be to get this ratio even higher, get it up to 84, 85%. So again, if you did 200 watts for your 3-minute test, then for your 12-minute test, we would like you to get to 168 or 170 watts. And at that point, you would definitely be a really, really strong time trialist / general classification profile. And that's a great sign of good sort of sustained power for triathlon. Of course, sustained power in this case, it just means that your threshold is kind of a high percentage of your VO2 max. That doesn't mean that you can hold a high percentage of threshold for your race. For that, you need to train specifically, and that's why the principle of specificity, which we talked about in point 4, is important. You can't just rely on a field test like this to say that, okay, I'm prepared for my race, because it doesn't work like that. But that was just an example of a KPI that I like to use. But regardless of how you come to what your cyclist profile is, you should use this principle. Try to think about your cyclist profile and work towards optimizing it for triathlon, because basically this helps answer the question, can I hold a high percentage of my threshold and of my VO2 max for a long time? And then if you find that you have room for improvement there, then that's great. Then you know what to work on. But if you find that you actually don't have much room for improvement, you've kind of eked out with your current threshold and VO2 max, you're kind of stuck, then you know that you need to raise your VO2 max and raise your threshold first to take that as priority. Key advice number 6, and I'll be brief with this one because we're going a bit long already, which I knew we would. But this is torque training or low cadence work on the bike. I think this can be beneficial for almost any triathlete of any distance. I prefer to give it as kind of zone 3 tempo work, so 80% of FTP, 85% of FTP, and working at cadences of 50 to 60 or maybe 60 to 70, depending on the athlete. Just be careful about joint health, and if you have had any issues with knee injuries or things like that, then this might not be for you. And I would always recommend this is for people that have had a bike fit and haven't had injuries. If you haven't had a bike fit, having a bike fit is a great way to prevent any problems from cropping up, because if they do, they are probably not because of the torque training itself, but because of a poor bike fit in combination with the torque training. Key advice number 7, and this one is specifically for long distance athletes, or half and full distance, and intermediate to advanced athletes especially, but also people that are newer to the distance, and maybe just the principle applies, but not necessarily as important as for the intermediate and advanced athletes. The principle is that longer rides might be more important than a higher frequency of workouts. So to give you an example, if you can ride for 7 hours per week, which is a good amount for many triathletes, for most triathletes, and you are an intermediate or advanced athlete focusing on half or full distance triathlon, then using those 7 hours over 3 rides, for example, one that is 3.5 hours, one that is 1.5 hours, and one that is 2 hours, might be better than doing it over 4 rides that might be 3.5, 1.5, 1, and 1. That's my opinion for this particular context that I described. And so one more thing on this. Longer rides doesn't mean that it has to be 3 hours or it's useless. It doesn't even mean that it has to be 2 hours and it's useless. But basically, that duration, if you have the minimum amount of, if you are doing 3 bike rides per week, that's quite good. And if you have another hour to allocate to cycling, then it may be, depending on what your current structure looks like, allocating that hour to one or several of your bike rides that you already have might be better than adding a 4th ride that is just 1 hour long. That is the gist of this principle and this advice. And number 8 is that, again, for long distance athletes, in particular intermediate and advanced athletes, doing fatigue resistance workouts. So this means doing moderately hard or even hard intensities after having already expended a lot of energy. For example, one of my favorites is to do maybe 2.5, 3 hours at high zone 2, between 65 and 75% of FTP, or 70 and 75% FTP. And then after that, do a 30-minute tempo segment at 85% of FTP, 80 to 85%. And yeah, that's a fantastic ride which will show you if you can still be strong and feel strong and perform after having expended 1,500 kilojoules, 2,000 kilojoules, maybe 2,500 kilojoules, depending on the event you're training for. And for cyclists, this is a principle that we can take even further, because it's even more important for them, given the nature of their racing. But for triathletes, I think this is a key type of workout, and it doesn't have to be a 30-minute tempo run. It can be 4 times 6 minutes of threshold riding, or it can be a lot of things. But fatigue resistance, doing moderately hard to hard intensities when already tired, when already having, not necessarily when tired, but when already having expended a lot of energy, is a great thing to do for your bike training. All right, so that was the physical aspect, and we are running low, so I will tackle the rest of the episode a little bit quicker. First, let's get into how to train for aerodynamics. So I just want to say that this is a bike training episode, so we won't talk about all the other ways you can improve aerodynamics, like getting a bike fit or buying new wheels or things of that nature, but only the training aspects. And key advice number 1 here is to do indoor training, because that allows you to be really, really focused on your position. Ideally, get a mirror so that you can watch yourself, and you can do things like if you have your laptop, for example, in front of you and you're on Swift or something like that, put that on a height where it's really appropriate for you to look forward, look to the road ahead, because that's what you will be doing in the triathlon. And put your race helmet on, at least every once in a while. Put your race helmet on and make sure that you can keep your gaze in front of you and look up the road, so to say, and hold it there and train those neck muscles and make sure that that's doable. So indoor training, you can basically control the environment or control your position so well, and you don't have to worry about traffic. So that's a great way to practice aerodynamics. But number 2 is outdoor training. You need to do that too, because it's one thing to be able to do it indoors, and outdoors in the real world, things are a bit more messy, and there is traffic and there is wind and there is changes in terrain. So of course, in terms of traffic, that's something that we don't have as much on race days. So try to find some place reasonably safe to do this type of training. But it is important to every once in a while go out and do some riding in the TT position outdoors, and focusing on both producing power but also being aerodynamic, and perhaps focusing most of all on the speed, because that's how we get from point A to point B the fastest, by having the highest speed, not by having the highest power. So that's something that is really important to practice outdoors as well as indoors, and practice in the TT position outdoors. And key advice number 3 is mobility. So you can improve your mobility by mobility training. This is something I would recommend doing together with a good physiotherapist, or even a bike fitter, or a bike fitter that is a physiotherapist would be great. But basically, if you have restricted mobility in your hips or hamstrings, then you might not be able to get into as good an aerodynamic position as you otherwise would. So working on this mobility and improving it over time, this is a long process, and you can't expect things to happen very quickly, but that will over time allow you to maybe be in a more aggressive position or put out more power in the position you currently have. So that is something that is really good for certain athletes. But again, I think this is something that you want to have assessed by a professional in the field, a physiotherapist, for example. And let's run through a quick list of common bike training mistakes to avoid. I've touched on some of them already, but I just want to summarize them here. The first one is to do all of your bike training indoors and not training outdoors, and also not training outdoors in the TT position, where you're focusing on speed just as much as you are focused on power. Again, speed is how we get from start to finish. The second one is simply not training enough in the TT position. period. Of course, if we're talking about non-draft triathlon here and holding a high power, but it goes without saying that we need to be able to hold that power in the specific position we're racing in. So you need to do training in the TT position if you want to maximize your performance ability. Mistake number three is not eating enough on the bike. And I would say this applies especially to intermediate and advanced athletes that tend to do more training overall and longer rides. So of course this applies also to beginners when they're doing longer rides, but advanced athletes in particular that might be averaging high watts and a lot of calories. The more calories you burn, the bigger the deficit you put yourself in, obviously. So the higher the power, the more reason you have to really, really focus on eating. But in general, intermediate and advanced athletes, a lot of intermediate and advanced athletes could do a better job of eating more on the bike, especially in those longer workouts. But longer here doesn't necessarily mean 4 hours. It can mean an hour and a half or 2 hours. So that will help your performance maybe in that workout, but even if it doesn't, it will definitely help your performance over the long term and make sure that you recover better for the next training day, and you don't put yourself in. You can do more quality training over time, put simply. Mistake number 4 is getting caught up in chasing marginal gains, and just stick. I mean, I'm not saying don't do that, but make sure that the basic principles are first and foremost, and you're focusing on that. And then you earn the privilege to chase some marginal gains as well. But don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. And mistake number 5, and this is for the more advanced athletes, and it's not necessarily as much as a mistake, but as it is, this is something that could be better, that could help you improve, and that I think a lot of athletes miss out on, and that is doing enough long workouts. Long is very relative here, of course, but let's say that you're an advanced athlete and you're typically doing a 3-hour long ride on the weekend, but your rides during the week are 1 hour, and 1.5 hour. If it's possible to increase that 1.5 hour ride to a 2-hour ride, even if it means skipping one of the 1 hour rides, I think that might be beneficial. So it's relative to what you can do with your life circumstances and logistics. But I just want to bring to everybody's attention that for intermediate and advanced athletes, longer bike workouts, especially when it comes to long distance non-draft triathlon, are really key, in my opinion. And this includes not just endurance rides, by the way. This includes 2-hour rides with quite a lot of quality in them, or 3-hour rides with a lot of quality in them. So it's not about doing long endurance rides necessarily. So it is just that length, the duration of the workout, regardless of what the content is, I think is a good driver of adaptation. And finally, let's do some example weekly structures and example workouts. So for a beginner training 2 times per week, I already kind of went through this. One ride would be a longer outdoor ride, for example, on the weekend, with endurance focus, but probably with some natural variations in intensity due to terrain and wind, and that I think is perfectly fine. The second ride can maybe be something a bit more focused and structured, so maybe even a turbo trainer or indoor trainer ride if you have one, or an outdoor ride if you don't. Closer to the races, this second ride should definitely be something with race specificity, so intervals at your target race power or heart rate or effort. So something like that, but farther out from the races, it can be something maybe a bit more intense, but of shorter duration, like threshold intervals or intense intervals above threshold, Vo2 Max intervals, if you want to call them that. And for intermediate or advanced athletes, there are really, for beginners as well, but there are really 100 ways you could do things. So I'm not saying that any of these structures is the best way or anything like that. They're just suggestions and examples that for a typical athlete, I think would work quite well. So if you're an intermediate athlete and you're limited to riding twice per week, that's not ideal because the bike is so important. So increasing to 3 rides per week would be much preferred. But if you can only ride twice per week, then a similar structure to the beginner training would be good. But just try to make those 2 rides, both the outdoor endurance ride and the structure ride, which can be indoors or outdoors, just try to make them as long as possible. within reason to get that total volume of riding up. If you're riding 3 times per week, then I would say 1 longer endurance ride, 1 ride with something around race pace, which is obviously very different for sprint compared to Ironman and everything in between. And for a sprint distance, it would be more like a threshold workout. And for Ironman, it would be something like high zone 2, low zone 3, and would probably have to be a lot longer. And then the third workout could be either another endurance workout, maybe with a fatigue resistance finish if it's a longer one, or maybe the longer endurance could be that fatigue resistance workout, and this could be just a shorter or moderate and duration endurance workout. Fatigue resistance, by the way, again, that was that long ride that finishes with 30 minutes of tempo, for example, or 4 times 6 minutes at threshold. But if your race pace workout was on the more intense side, and so for example, you're training for a sprint or Olympic or even a half distance race, and there's only so much you can handle in any given week, then it makes sense to make this third ride something lighter, an endurance ride again. If, however, you are more limited by time than by your ability to recover, or if your distance is Ironman, so that the race pace workout wasn't particularly intense, then this third workout could be some sort of intensity that complements your race pace workout. So, for example, if you're a 71.3 athlete and you're racing at 80 to 85% of FTP, then it could be, this third workout could be some intervals at just 1 rung above race pace, so 85 to 95%, in the 85 to 95% range. But if you're a sprint or even Olympic distance athlete, so your race pace is somewhere between 90 to 100% FTP, then something that complements race pace would be in the 80 to 90% range. And that would basically bridge the gap between endurance and race pace. And likewise, Ironman athletes could also be looking at something in the 80 to 90% range. So basically supporting the race pace at something in the 70s from above. And finally, if you're training 4 times per week, then 2 workouts with endurance focus. Maybe one of them could have a fatigue resistance element, so finishing in tempo or threshold. 1 workout with a race pace focus, and 1 race pace support, as described above. If depending on the challenge level of those, the race pace and the race pace support, then you might not do basically the fatigue resistance would be a quality workout in my mind. So if you do that, then maybe the race pace support would be a very light quality workout with mostly endurance, but maybe a little bit of just touching upon some intensity around race pace. So basically not adding that much load and being mostly endurance focused. But again, this comes down to the individual athlete, and it really depends on the fatigue resistance. As I said, it's an advanced strategy, and it's not something that everybody needs to do, and you definitely don't need to do it all the time. So the general structure would be simply 2 workouts of endurance focus, 1 of race pace focus, and 1 of race pace support focus. So yeah, note that there will be times during the year when you might or should focus on high intensity above threshold Vo2 Max workout. So these example weeks are just a few snapshots, and they do cover kind of the most important principles, because as we discussed, sustained power really is the holy grail in triathlon, and I think that you need to train quite specifically for that. But that said, there are, as we discussed, situations a higher Vo2 Max is always great, and there are some situations where that is the only logical next step if you're basically maxed out on what you can do with your current Vo2 Max. So yeah, and also note that you can include high intensity maintenance, as I described previously, maybe every other week, doing a little bit in a build set before your main race pace workout or whatever it is, or do a kitchen sink workout every now and then. Now, finally, some example workouts, and these are for an intermediate level triathlete, so scale down or up accordingly. For endurance workouts, the duration that you do depends obviously on the distance that you're training for and the time of season. 2 hours is probably enough for an intermediate athlete focusing on the sprint distance, even in the specific phase or race preparation phase. Whereas if you're focusing on the Ironman, then the long ride would be maybe 3 hours farther out from the race. And then, of course, when you get closer and you get into that specific preparation period, then you would be building it to doing at least 2 or maybe 3 5-hour or 5-hour plus rides. So note, however, that you don't necessarily have to do a long ride every single week, regardless of if you're talking about 2-hour long rides or 3-hour long rides or 5-hour long rides. If that's difficult for you to fit in, I think it's beneficial to do a long ride every week, but it's not necessary. You can do it every other week, and it will still be great. The intensity of the endurance ride or the long ride, or endurance rides in general, I should say, whether they're long or not, should be such that they feels comfortable to start with. But maybe towards the end, if you're doing a long ride, it can and will feel harder. It's sometimes very hard, depending, of course, on how long the ride is and how conditioned you are. But a ballpark in terms of power, percentage of FTP, 60 to 70% is good. Of course, some rides you might be pushing it to do 70 to 75%. That's fine. But I think that a good principle to take away is that just because 75% is still in Coggan Zone 2, or usually considered Zone 2, I also use that for Zone 2, that doesn't mean that you always should be at 75% or 74% or 74.5%. Endurance is a big range, and generally speaking, you just want it to feel quite comfortable, and you want to keep an eye on heart rate as well and have heart rate remain in Zone 2 for most of the ride. And above all, make sure that you can hit your hard workouts with quality and not be fatigued for them. A fatigue resistance workout example, so I already alluded to this, let's say an hour and a half at 65 to 75% of FTP, and then 30 minutes at 80 to 85% FTP would be a great example. That would be a light one. For a much more challenging one, try 3 hours at 65 to 75% and then 30 minutes at 80 to 85%. Intensity maintenance that I talked about could be, for example, an hour and a half of endurance riding at 60 to 70% FTP, but include a 3-minute interval at 110% of FTP, after 30 minutes, after 1 hour, and after an hour and 20 minutes. A race pace workout example, and let's take 7.3 distance here. It can be simple, 3 times, 20 to 30 minutes, 30 minutes perhaps, when you're getting close to the race and getting very fit at your target race power, 80 to 85%, with 10-minute recoveries. I do like to add power variations as well, as I described before. So the average across the 30 minutes ends up being target race power, but some of it is below and some of it is above. And finally, let's say a threshold workout example, which is also a race-specific workout for sprint and Olympic distance try. 4 times 10 minutes at 95% with 4 minutes of rest would be a great example. All right, that's it for this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. And next week, of course, we'll do a run one to finish off this particular swim, bike, and run training series. I have a piece of housekeeping I want to get out there before wrapping this episode up, though. We're looking for a coach, an experienced and knowledgeable and passionate coach to add to our Scientific Triathlon coaching team. If you think that you fit that description, then please email me, michael@scientifictriathlon.com. That's Michael with a K. Send me your coaching CV, and if this sounds like you, and then we can see if it seems like a good fit. We'll have a chat and see if you're the one for the role. And also, if you are not a coach or you're not interested in this, but you know somebody that might be, please share this. And because, really, we want as many quality candidates as we can, and select the best possible candidate for the position. Links in the episode description will be available to the TTS Thursday episode archive and also to all previous cycling related episodes on that triathlon show, so you can check that out. And as I said, last week we did a similar episode but on swim training, so if you missed that, go and check it out. Keep sending in topic suggestions and questions that we can answer in future podcasts to my email. And if you are interested in coaching or training plans, go and check out scientifictriathlon.com and the coaching or training plans pages respectively, where we have a lot of information. And contact me directly if you have any further questions or want to discuss around any of those products or services. Thank you finally to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and get a free hydration plan and get 15% off your order of electrolytes with the promo code THATTriathlonshow15. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses, and get 20% off your order with a promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.